The church bells of St. Aldwyn's echoed through the tranquil hills of the Cotswolds, announcing what was supposed to be a perfect union. The Sinclair estate had spared no expense. White roses lined the aisle, antique chandeliers bathed the stone interior in warm light, and guests in tailored suits whispered excitedly. At the altar stood Oliver Sinclair, heir to one of England's most prestigious families, adjusting his cufflinks with controlled poise. He had been raised for this kind of day. Graceful, curated, and watched by the world. And yet, even as the organ swelled with the first notes of the bridal march, something in his chest tightened. He chalked it up to nerves. But it wasn't nerves. When Lila Hartwell entered the chapel, all heads turned. Her ivory gown glimmered like moonlight on still water, and a soft lace veil hid her expression. Oliver smiled, rehearsed, princely, but Lila's slow steps were deliberate, like someone approaching the edge of a cliff. She reached him. The priest began his words. But before vows could be exchanged, Lila leaned in, brushing her lips close to Oliver's ear. What she said froze him in place. "I know who made my mother disappear." Oliver's breath caught. For a moment, the choir was drowned out by the pounding of his heart. His smile faltered, but he quickly caught himself, nodding gently as if she'd whispered a sweet nothing. She pulled back, her gaze calm and unwavering. Behind them, the guests clapped at the romantic gesture, oblivious. But inside, Oliver felt the ground shift beneath him. He hadn't heard that name, her mother's name, in 20 years. How could she know? Oliver's hands trembled slightly as the ceremony moved forward, though he concealed it beneath a well-practiced smile. The priest's voice faded into the background as his mind spiraled, replaying Lila's whisper again and again. "I know who made my mother disappear." It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a plea. It was a statement. Calm, deliberate, and deadly certain. Lila stood beside him like a porcelain statue, serene yet unreadable. He dared not glance her way, afraid she'd see the fear blooming in his eyes. As they turned to face the guests at the conclusion of the vows, Oliver caught sight of someone he hadn't seen in nearly a decade. A man seated on the far left pew, alone. Lean, sharp-featured, with silver streaks cutting through dark hair. For a split second, Oliver's breath hitched. That couldn't be, no. Not him. But it was. Hugo Denton. Former private investigator. Once hired by the Sinclair family. Dismissed under shadowy circumstances. That man had dug too deep, asked the wrong questions. Questions about staff. About stolen heirlooms. About a woman who worked in the West Wing, who vanished one winter night with her young daughter. Oliver's eyes narrowed. Why would Hugo be here? He wasn't on the guest list. And yet there he was, watching. Not the ceremony. Not the couple. Watching Lila. Oliver began to sweat beneath the collar of his custom Seville row suit. The reception was held in a grand marquee beside the lake, with jazz echoing off the water and champagne flowing like gold. Lila played the part of the radiant bride flawlessly, laughing, posing, even sharing her first dance. But behind the performance, her eyes scanned the room carefully. She was waiting. Eventually, as guests mingled and the sun began to dip behind the trees, Lila slipped away from the crowd. Oliver noticed, of course. He followed, careful to keep his distance. She wandered past the hedges, down a stone path that led to the estate's abandoned glasshouse, a relic from his grandfather's time, now overgrown and forgotten. Lila stepped inside. Oliver paused behind a tree, heart thudding. Inside the glasshouse, sunlight streamed through cracked panes and vines crept along the floor. And there, standing amidst the wild greenery, was Hugo Denton. "I told you not to do it at the altar," Hugo said without turning. "He'll be watching every move now." "I wanted him to feel it," Lila replied. "To know the storm is coming." Oliver felt the blood drain from his face. They knew each other. They planned this. Lila Hartwell wasn't just a mysterious beauty from a minor countryside lineage. She was working with Hugo Denton, the man his family tried to silence. And she had just married into the heart of it all. Lila closed the rusted door of the glasshouse behind her and turned to face Hugo. Her veil now draped loosely over one shoulder, revealing eyes sharp with purpose. She was no longer the glowing bride from moments ago. In her place stood someone with steel in her spine, someone who had come to collect a debt buried in secrets. "I only had one condition," she said. "I needed it to be public. I needed him to know I wasn't afraid." Hugo gave a small nod, his face unreadable. You've made your entrance, I'll give you that. But now the real work begins. Oliver Sinclair doesn't just roll over. I'm counting on that, she replied. Outside, Oliver stood frozen behind the ivy-covered trellis. The pieces were falling into place, but they formed a picture he didn't want to believe. His family had secrets, yes, old sins that were conveniently buried. But this? Was Lila truly the daughter of her? 20 years ago, a maid named Isabel vanished overnight. Rumors whispered of a scandal. An affair with the late Charles Sinclair, Oliver's father. Then silence. The matter was hushed, record sealed, staff paid off. Oliver had been just a child. He barely remembered the woman's face. Only the sound of crying in the hallway and the way his father slammed doors. And now her daughter had walked down the aisle in a designer dress, slipping like a dagger into his life. He returned to the reception just as the last speeches were finishing. The guests were drunk on love and champagne, entirely unaware of the storm building under their feet. Lila appeared minutes later, arm looped through his, a radiant smile plastered on her lips. You okay, darling? She asked sweetly. He glanced at her. Fine. Just overwhelmed. It's a lot, all of this. She leaned in, lips near his ear again. Get used to it. I plan on making this marriage very memorable. Oliver swallowed hard. Later that night, in the honeymoon suite of the estate's eastern wing, Lila stood at the window, looking out into the dark fields. The moon illuminated her reflection faintly in the glass, but her gaze was far beyond the landscape. In her hand, she held an old photograph. A woman with tired eyes and a girl clutching her skirt. The back read, Isabel and Lila, 2005. Behind her, Oliver stirred. You never told me much about your mother, he said, still half asleep. No, she replied quietly. I didn't. The silence thickened. Because telling him would ruin everything. Because the truth wasn't just about what happened to her mother. It was about what Lila had discovered. And who had helped make Isabel disappear. Rain lashed the windows of the east wing as Lila tiptoed across the parquet floor. It was nearly 2 a.m, and Oliver was sound asleep after one too many glasses of scotch. She had timed it perfectly. The estate was silent, blanketed by storm and shadows. She knelt beside the old dresser, brushing away the dust from its legs. The floorboards here were original, untouched for generations. She tapped them gently one by one, until she heard it, a hollow thunk beneath the left panel. Her fingers worked swiftly, lifting the loose plank, revealing a narrow space beneath. Inside, wrapped in waxy cloth and brittle with age, was a letter. Its edges were browned and the handwriting faded, but she knew the name signed at the bottom before she even read it. Isabel. With trembling hands, Lila unfolded the paper. The ink was watermarked and worn, but legible. If you are reading this, it means I failed. I kept my silence for the sake of my daughter. But Charles, he wasn't the man I thought I loved. The night I threatened to go to the police, he told me I'd never leave this house again. I've hidden copies of the bank transfers and my journal. If something happens to me, find them. Find Hugo. He knows everything. Lila's eyes burned with unshed tears. This wasn't just revenge. This was justice. Unfinished, cold, waiting for 20 years. She tucked the letter into the lining of her robe and quietly returned to bed. At breakfast the next morning, Oliver seemed unusually bright. I've been thinking, he said over toast, about moving abroad. Paris, maybe. A fresh start. Just us. Lila's fork paused mid-air. Paris? That's sudden. I just feel like we've had enough of the Sinclair estate, he said, laughing. Too many ghosts here. She smiled, but inside, her instincts flared. He knows. He'd sensed her shift, the crack in her facade. Later that day, she slipped into Hugo's office in the West Library. I found it, she said simply, handing him the letter. Hugo read it, jaw clenched. He killed her. There's no doubt now. There's more, Lila added. She mentioned bank transfers. A journal. Hugo opened a drawer and pulled out a faded ledger book. I've kept this hidden for years. I knew something was off. My father didn't just die. He found out about Charles and tried to go to the police. 2 weeks later, he was found drowned in the river. They called it an accident. I never believed it. Lila stared at him. So this family, it's rotted all the way through. Not all of us, Hugo said. She nodded. Then help me finish what my mother started. Outside, the clouds broke just enough to let a sliver of light through the rain. It glinted off the manor windows like the sharp edge of a blade. The hunt had begun. The manor had grown colder in recent days, or perhaps it was just the chill Lila felt deep within. She stared at herself in the mirror above her dressing table, her reflection composed, elegant, but behind the painted lips and porcelain skin, she was sharpening like a blade. She had spent the last week gathering pieces, ledger entries, forged signatures, even coded emails that Hugo had retrieved from an old laptop once used by their late father. Every puzzle piece led back to the same truth. Oliver had engineered his rise through charm and ruin, stepping on those who trusted him most. This morning, Oliver watched her closely as she descended the staircase in a navy silk gown, her posture graceful, her smile fixed. He offered her tea, his tone casual, but his eyes held a question. She accepted the cup, her fingers brushing his briefly. You've been restless, she noted softly. So have you, he replied, setting the saucer down. I know you've been talking to Hugo. Her pulse quickened. And what if I have? Oliver leaned in, voice quiet but razor sharp. Then I'd remind you of your place in this family. You're my wife now, Lila. There's no need to dig up ghosts. She stared back evenly. Ghosts don't stay buried forever. Later that evening, Lila hosted a quiet dinner. Just Oliver, Hugo, and herself. She had instructed the staff to take the night off. The setting was intimate, candlelit, deceptively warm. I found something, she said after the second course, sliding a folder across the table. Oliver opened it and froze. Inside were copies of forged bank documents, names tied to shell companies, and a photo, one Lila had retrieved from an old archive, showing Oliver standing beside Isabel in a cafe weeks before her disappearance. You've been busy, Oliver said coldly. I know what you did, she replied. To my mother. To Hugo's father. And to every person who stood in your way. Oliver's jaw tensed. You can't prove any of this holds up in court. Maybe not, Hugo interjected, placing a voice recorder on the table. But public opinion is harder to control. The red light blinked softly. Oliver's face shifted, from arrogant to calculating. Is this what it is now? Blackmail. No, Lila said calmly. It's a choice. Leave this house. Sign over your holdings. Disappear. Or we go public, and you lose everything, including your freedom. Oliver stared at her for a long moment, then slowly began to laugh. Oh, Lila. You've grown teeth. She rose to her feet, meeting his gaze. No. I've always had them. I just stopped hiding behind a smile. Later that night, Lila stood alone in the Hall of Portraits, staring at the painting of her mother. Isabel, elegant and tragic in brushstrokes and memory. She whispered, We're almost there, Mum. Then she turned, the echo of her heels sharp against the marble, her plan locked in motion. The next morning broke with an eerie silence at Greystone Hall. Rain tapped faintly against the high windows, and clouds loomed over the estate like silent witnesses to the storm brewing inside. Oliver was gone. He had left sometime during the night. No note. No goodbye. Just an empty closet and a silence that felt heavier than any confrontation. Lila stood by the window in her robe, the cool glass beneath her fingertips. Part of her had expected him to lash out, to fight. But this retreat, it was calculated. He's planning something, Hugo said as he entered the drawing room, his shirt still unbuttoned from a long night. Lila nodded slowly. Of course he is. Oliver never walks away unless he already has a backup plan. Indeed, by noon, the headlines had begun to swirl. Prominent business heir accuses siblings of forgery and defamation. Greystone family feud escalates as scandal goes public. Oliver had beaten them to the press. He's turning the narrative, Lila murmured, her eyes scanning the screen. Making himself the victim. But Hugo smirked. Let him play that card. I've got recordings of him admitting to fraud, and copies of every transfer he made under fake names. They met with a solicitor in London by late afternoon, providing every piece of evidence they had. Lila kept her composure as they outlined the web Oliver had spun, How he manipulated family assets, orchestrated fake investments, and even played a part in the vanishing of Isabel Gray. "It's strong," the solicitor said, tapping the documents. "And if what you say is true, he won't be able to outrun this." Still, Lila couldn't shake the unease gnawing at her. Oliver had vanished too easily. He was a strategist, not a coward. And just as the thought crossed her mind, her phone buzzed. A private number. One message. "You're clever, Lila. But you forget. I never play fair." Attached was a grainy photo. A woman in a hospital bed. Pale. Bruised. Her blood ran cold. It was her mother. "How is this possible?" Lila whispered. "She's dead. I buried her." But the woman in the photo, aged, battered, was unmistakably Isabel Gray. "She must have been in hiding," Hugo said. "Or worse, held." Lila clenched the phone, fury and dread twisting her chest. He used her. All this time he had her. Hugo's jaw tightened. "He's luring you. Trying to break you." But Lila was already on her feet, grabbing her coat. "Then he underestimated me again." They followed the location tag in the metadata of the photo. Essex, a private care facility listed under a dummy company traced back to one of Oliver's shell firms. By nightfall, they stood outside a bleak, gray building hidden behind ivy-covered walls. Inside, the air reeked of bleach and secrets. A nurse looked up as they entered, startled. "We're here for Isabel Gray," Lila said firmly. The woman hesitated, then led them to a small, locked ward. And there she was. Thin. Ghostly. But alive. Lila dropped to her knees beside the bed, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Mum. It's me." Isabel stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She whispered, voice frail and cracking, "Lila." Then the door slammed shut behind them. They turned. And Oliver stood there, soaked from the rain, eyes wild. "You always were too curious, little dove," he growled. "Now none of you are leaving." Oliver's presence filled the sterile hospital room like a shadow stretching into every corner. The door behind him locked with a mechanical click. Hugo moved instinctively in front of Lila and her mother. "You've completely lost it," Hugo growled. "This won't end well for you." But Oliver merely smirked, his eyes glinting with a madness barely contained. He stepped closer, dripping rainwater onto the linoleum floor, the tension in the room coiling tighter with every step. "I was never going to let you ruin everything I built," he said coldly. "You don't understand what it took, what I gave up, for this family. For power." "You mean what you stole?" Lila snapped, rising to her feet. "You didn't build anything, Oliver. You manipulated. You lied. And you used my mother as leverage. That ends now." Oliver's gaze flicked to Isabel, who had slipped into unconsciousness again, too weak to witness the confrontation. "You shouldn't have come," he hissed. "You forced my hand." But Lila took a step forward, steady despite the fear twisting in her stomach. "No, you underestimated me. Just like everyone else." Suddenly, sirens wailed in the distance. Oliver's smirk faltered. Lila held up a small device in her hand. A simple digital recorder, on and blinking red. "I've been recording since I walked through that door," she said softly. "Every word. Including your threats. The police are on their way." Oliver lunged. But Hugo was faster. He slammed into Oliver with enough force to knock him back against the wall. They grappled, fists flying, until Oliver's foot slipped on the wet floor, sending him crashing to the ground. Lila rushed to Hugo's side just as officers burst through the entrance, weapons raised. "Step away from him." One barked. Hands raised, Hugo stepped back. Lila showed the recorder and pointed at Oliver. "He's behind everything. My mother's disappearance. The financial fraud. It's all here." Oliver snarled from the ground, pinned by two officers. "You think this is over? You have no idea who you're dealing with." But the room was already filled with the clack of cuffs and radio chatter. And for once, Oliver's threats held no weight. He was finished. Hours later, Greystone Hall stood silent once more, this time with a sense of peace. Lila sat by her mother's hospital bed, holding her frail hand. The doctors had confirmed Isabel would recover, slowly, but fully. Hugo entered the room quietly, a soft smile on his face. They charged him, he said. Multiple counts. It'll stick. Lila exhaled, the weight of months' years, lifting from her chest. He wanted power, she whispered. But he lost everything. No, Hugo replied. He never had anything real to begin with. Lila looked at her mother, then out the window as dawn began to break. The sky was soft with pink and gold. For the first time in a long while, she felt free. But she knew it wasn't over yet. There were still secrets in the walls of Greystone Hall. Still shadows in the past. And she would face them. One truth at a time. A month had passed since Oliver's arrest. Greystone Hall, once a theater of shadows and secrets, now basked in light. The lawyers had cleared the last of the forged documents, and with her mother's recovery underway, Lila officially became the rightful heir. But the weight of legacy hung heavy. One afternoon, Lila walked alone through the halls. Her footsteps echoed against marble, her fingers trailing along banisters carved by generations of her ancestors. The portraits lining the walls, many of whose stories had been buried by Oliver's ambition, seemed to look upon her with new regard. She entered her father's old study, untouched for years. Dust had settled like memory, quiet and undisturbed. On the desk sat an old leather-bound journal. She opened it. Inside were sketches, rough, lively drawings of her as a child, done in her father's hand. Notes filled the margins. She'll be bold. She'll be brave. She'll change this place someday. Lila swallowed hard. He had seen her. And somehow, despite everything he had known, Hugo returned from London with news. The council approved the reversal of all asset transfers, he said. Everything Oliver took. It's coming back to you. Greystone Enterprises, the estate holdings, all of it. Lila nodded, eyes focused on a stack of letters she'd been writing. I'm not keeping it all, she said simply. There are people he ruined. Businesses, families. I'll make reparations. You don't have to fix all his damage, Hugo said gently. No. But I can start. She turned to him. And I want you to head the foundation. Help me turn Greystone into something better. Not just a name people fear. Hugo looked surprised, then moved closer. Are you sure? I trust you, she replied. And I want to keep building. With someone who stood by me when I had nothing. Their eyes held for a moment too long, the unspoken finally beginning to rise between them. But there was still more to do. The day of the unveiling was overcast, but the light broke through in soft patches as guests arrived. In the center courtyard, where once Oliver had hosted his ruthless parties, now stood a new symbol. A glass-walled community center bearing Isabel's name. Lila gave a quiet speech. She didn't speak of revenge or scandal. She spoke of truth. Of building something lasting from ruin. And as applause rang out and her mother looked on with tears in her eyes, Lila felt, finally, at peace. That night, back in her room, she sat by the window. Outside, the estate was quiet. Peaceful. Hugo joined her silently, 2 mugs of tea in hand. So, he said, what comes next? Lila looked out toward the garden, where daffodils had begun to bloom again. Whatever I choose, she whispered. And for the first time it was entirely true.